afternoon. Testing,
Everybody.
testing.
This is my
Are we working?
time for me.
Oh, you have to just hold.
And then my boss, I moved back when I was back. I said,
It's
you can have two guys.
testing. That's right. Hi, I'm Joel Starr. I'm the senior fellow here at the Translating Leadership
There's one
Network.
of the proposals.
And I want to welcome you here. This is our last panel.
Excuse me.
And I just want to say a couple words before I enter just this distinguished panel. And this is the last panel on the challenges, hurdles, and opportunities to investigative reporting. And the question is, what exactly is investigative reporting in this day and age? So that'll be one of the questions at least I'll ask, and I'm certainly interested in what the audience's definition is as well as those of the panel. I'm going to ask each panelist to give a 5 to 10 minute introduction about themselves and a presentation. And then I'm going to take the speaker's prerogative and ask you a couple of questions and then open up to the audience. And if there's anybody with iPhones, please put it on silence. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul Beckett with the Wall Street Journal.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Paul Beckett with the Wall Street Journal, as Joey said. I've worked at Dow Jones, parent company of the Wall Street Journal, my entire career. So that is 34 years and counting, 25 of them with the Wall Street Journal. I was originally in New York for the classic Wall Street Journal beat, covering Wall Street and banking. Then I moved to London to London Bureau Chief. So I was there in 2004 and covered the terrorist bombings, probably the story that stood out the most, the subway bombings and the bus bombings in 2005. I then moved to New Delhi as South Asia Bureau Chief and was there for 6 years in what was easily the greatest adventure of my career and our family's life. And that was covering India and Afghanistan and Pakistan at a very fascinating and hot moment, and also included covering the Mumbai attacks in 2008. After that, we moved to Hong Kong, where I was Asia editor, and I watched the sad decline, or the start of the sad decline of Hong Kong as a press freedom center. And when I first got there, there was this rather quaint perception that Hong Kong might become, that China might become more like Hong Kong. And over the years that we were there, it became very clear that Hong Kong was going to become more like China. So in 2016, I was named as the new Washington Bureau Chief in August of 2016, and I thought, how hard could it be to cover President Hillary Clinton? Everything that I've done before, and we arrived in December of 2016, and I've been Washington Bureau Chief ever since, until very recently, where I have taken on a new role, which is advocating and working full-time to secure the release of our reporter, Adam Gershkovich, who was detained, wrongfully detained in Russia at the end of March. And we're now 7 months into that, and we'd like to see more movement, so it is now my job to help with that effort to see how quickly we can get him back. So, lovely to see you all. I look forward to the conversation, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, as you know, you worked for 35 years. I actually worked for 20 years, so I started when I was about 10 years old. So my name is Cherelle. I'm currently an editor on the Global Climate Desk in the AP. My role is Climate Collaborations Editor, and it's something new that AP is exploring, where we partner with small newsrooms to increase and strengthen the coverage of climate change with AP's support through editorial support, photos, data visualization, and so forth. So it's really partnering with Global South newsrooms to increase the coverage of climate. But I'm speaking here today in my previous role, reporting from the Pacific Islands, reporting on political crisis, conflict in, political conflict within Samoa and the Pacific, and as well as covering the climate crisis across our Pacific Island states. Previously, I worked for The Guardian for 4 years as a Pacific correspondent, covering issues, across different island nations. as small and as beautiful and stunning as the Pacific are, we do have some issues that are very interesting and nuanced, and does require more than a cursory approach. So I've had the privilege of also working with the Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, AFP, and a few others in reporting on island nations. And I also did some reporting for the Economist Intelligence Unit, and a few others in the US. That's my story.
My name is Robert Worth. I'm a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. I also occasionally write for The Atlantic and other magazines. My journalism career was, whenever younger people ask me about it, I say just don't do what I did, because it's not exactly neither conventional nor desirable. I sort of spent much of my 20s in graduate school, but realized pretty soon I didn't want to be there. So I left, floundered about a bit, and then got a job first here in Washington, writing for the Washington Monthly. A wonderful publication. It still exists in sort of attenuated form, but it used to be a kind of, almost like a kind of journalism school, where you would work for 2 years for a brilliant but cantankerous and difficult editor, Cherelle, and then he would help you get a job. And I got a job at the New York Times, writing it first for the Metro section, which was a huge shock to me that they hired me in the first place, because I had no journalism, I had no newspaper experience at all. And had never really written on deadline. So it was, the first few weeks and months were a little traumatizing, but I got used to it and eventually learned to love it. I'm from Manhattan, so it was kind of a rediscovery of New York City for me to write about. Not just Manhattan, all 5 boroughs, but I had wanted for some time to do foreign correspondence, and in particularly the Middle East. When I was in graduate school, I was actually there for literature, but Princeton has a really good Near Eastern Studies program. I had gotten interested in the region at that time. So I jumped at the chance to go to Iraq in 2003, and I pretty much stayed then in the Arab world, for covering Iraq for the first 3 years, the most miserable years, I guess, until 2006. And then they made me the Beirut bureau chief, so I did that until the end of 2010. And then they nicely gave me the job I really sort of wanted all along, which was to write for the magazine, which I did covering the Arab Spring and all the related events for a couple of years. I then took a little time off and wrote a book about the Arab uprisings, which was published in 2016. I went back to writing for the magazine. I guess I consider I wrote from India, some, a country that I'd been spending time with since I was young. In fact, I was there just after the 2008. They sent me from Beirut to go and help out, and it was an amazing experience. But I've written also from various parts of Europe, Japan, and other places. I'm not sure that I don't think I qualify as an investigative journalist really, but much of what I've done, I suppose, is investigative journalism. I mean, many of the stories I work on take months, sometimes years, to put together. So, since I'm not exactly sure what the strict definition is, certainly some of what I've done would qualify as investigative journalism.
Well, Robert, you just anticipated my first question, because this is a panel discussion on the challenges, hurdles, and opportunities to investigative reporting. And what exactly is investigative reporting these days? We have a situation where there's conflicts right now, the Hamas and Israel and Ukraine. It's tough to get the reporters in. There's no real embedding that's going on as far as I know, and can you do investigative stories in? And actually, I was just talking with Paul here about the New York Times. Was this a investigative reporting on the rocket that exploded in the parking lot of the Gaza hospital? There was no real conclusion, but was that an investigative report that was on the front page of the New York Times? So I'll start with you, if we could pass the microphone all the way down, and I asked the other two speakers to talk about, comment on this, or just your experiences with regard to investigative reporting in the past.
Does this
So
work?
I don't think it.
Oh, it works.
It's for.
No, it works, it works.
It does? Okay.
You just very closely put
No
it
need,
on.
no need.
Works well.
All right.
I guess I think of investigative reporting as in-depth reporting that is aimed at uncovering some set of facts or truths that have been very, very difficult to get at. In other words, it's not just aimed at narrative. Much of what I do as a magazine writer is really just about assembling a story that hasn't really been told, and that may take a long time. But I think investigative journalism really implies sort of, there's some set of facts that have relevance, whether politically or militarily or what have you, that are deemed to be important and whose confirmation or discovery would have serious repercussions. I mean, I know that, that's always the framework for big investigative projects, is sort of, we're aiming to bring about reforms in some particular sector of government or whatever, to expose truths that are bound to have important social or political repercussions. I guess that's the way I would frame it. And again, I did trying to think of examples of much of what I do is it revolves around a narrative, but I did a story about a kidnapping in 2017 of a group of Qataris who'd gone falcon hunting in southern Iraq, and there were all kinds of questions about what had happened to them. A ransom had allegedly been paid, was it really paid, how much was the ransom, what was the ransom for? There were very definite questions that didn't have answers, and so much of what I did over the following months was to try to get answers to those questions. That's just one example of investigative reporting. But again, there are specialists who know the field better than I do.
Cherelle.
So I'm glad you also say you don't necessarily identify as an investigative reporting, because I also connect in the same way. But I feel like a really good way to define it would be if the information is not freely available or accessible, and nor is there a platform or a human being who can freely answer your question, then it becomes an investigative piece. If you are taking at least 5 to 6 steps to get the truth and to find the information, you are henceforth investigating the story. This is besides like the value of an investigative piece and so forth. That's just a brief answer and my perspective.
I will only maybe just shade what you both have said, which is I view it as something where you are producing reporting on a subject that would far rather not see that information made public. And that it is revelatory, it is against the interest or against the participation often, almost always I think, against the desire of the subject that you're writing about, and it tells you something that ultimately reveals something. You rarely do a major investigation and come out thinking better of the subject that you are writing about. So I think it is really an effort to use whatever sources are available. I think sometimes if you are crunching huge amounts of data, that might be freely available data, but if you have the skills to pull all that data together and you're dealing in terabytes, which most of us would say that's nice, but if you can figure out patterns in that lead to a conclusion, I think that is an example of publicly available information that you are dissecting and analyzing in a revelatory way that is going to yield a result that is in some way morally, financially, whatever, shocking to a reader or viewer, then that would qualify. Overall, I think it's a term that's far too often bandied about, and I think if people walk around, I'm always a little suspicious if someone says, I say, what do you do? And oh, you're a reporter, great. No, I'm an investigative reporter. Well, excuse me. So there's a bit, there was one, we used to have a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who covered accounting, which would seem innocuous enough if you get a call from someone who says you're the accounting reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Okay, you probably take the call, and he was absolutely insistent. He went to the Met to define himself as the financial fraud reporter of the Wall Street Journal, and just from a practical experience, you're just like, who's going to take your call? I'm sorry, yeah, so he's calling, yeah, I'm the financial fraud reporter, is he available? You know, it's, there's just sometimes, I think every reporter should have it in their portfolio that they can do investigations, and they should have the ambition of doing an investigation, and I think it's a disservice in a newsroom. Sometimes, obviously, there are people who specialize in it, but if that means that everybody else feels that they're therefore unable to pursue investigative journalism, I don't think that's a service to your readers, viewers, listeners, whatever. So that's how I would.
Thank you, perfect. I was going to ask you, can you give me any examples, and that is very informative and illuminating and humorous. Cherelle, do you have any examples, especially with regard to an area that's probably not read about or covered very much here in Washington, the Pacific Island issues, especially with China on the horizon and in the news in that part of the world as well?
Sure, what's interesting is whenever the US discusses the Pacific or our islands, it's always in view of what's China's role, or there's always some external impact or aspect to it, which I always find amusing. But at the same time, you know, to your question of are there issues that have not been explored in the US, there's many issues in the Pacific Island countries, political, environmental, human rights, that have not even seen the light of day in international media, but it doesn't make it list. So a really good example, since you asked about China, I did do an investigation on some of the projects that China implements in the Pacific Islands, and they do it in a very strategic way. First of all, China's role in the Pacific is, you know, they were present and strategizing their influence in the Pacific Islands before the US even acknowledged the major impacts of these small island nations. So as China's been moving into the Pacific in a very big way in the past 20 years, in the last 10 years, there's been an influx of what appears to be environmental projects or sustainability projects, which are in line with the Green Belt initiative that China has. The unfortunate thing is, with aid that we receive from, say, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and other countries, there are very strict safeguards, environmental and social safeguards that are in place. So the investigation I did was looking at specific projects that China had in Samoa, namely either bridges or a hospital, a large building of some sort, and looking at the process by which they observed and or adhered to social and environmental safeguards that are usually in place for projects of that type. And I found that there was, you know, when it comes to China-funded projects, they had no requirements to adhere to. So they can do, the government can pretty much build anything they want with the permission of the host government, and you know, demolish native trees or even heritage sites or any socially significant sites or culturally significant sites. So that was a, you know, that's an example of a nuanced story that happened on an island, but has this broader and more global implication on the harm of China's aid, you know, globally in the global south.
Very, very educational. I had no idea. In my capacity, working over the U.S. Institute of Peace, I handle the Middle East issues, and we run into the exact same thing with regard to those projects of the Belt and Road. I wanted to switch gears just a little bit. The last panel was talking about artificial intelligence and fake news. And the last panel, a number of the speakers said, well, basically the traditional journalism, the old-fashioned shoe leather, all of those types of techniques in the internet age are dead. Is that true? Paul?
Well, I'll try and tie the two together because the biggest investigation I ever had the privilege to be part of, the most impactful one, was around about, I can't remember, $8 billion, I think we got up to, of money that the Malaysian government was siphoning off from a national fund called 1MDB. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that from a few years ago, but that was essentially the Prime Minister of Malaysia at the time, Najib Razak, and various accomplices created this fund that was designed to benefit the people of Malaysia through building projects and others. And a tremendous amount of that money got siphoned off through extraordinarily complicated financial maneuvers involving several other countries. And some of the money ended up going to Hollywood, where Najib Razak's son was a producer of the movie Wolf of Wall Street. And that money, yes. I mean, it was one of those stories that you probably come across once or twice in your career where you're like, God, it really does have absolutely everything, and it really did. And so this was a years-long exercise that the reporters and myself and a couple of other editors in Hong Kong pursued, and it would only have happened, and in the end, one thing led to another, and it did actually lead to the ouster of the ruling party in Malaysia for the first time in Malaysia's independence. That party had been in power for 60 years, and it finally got ousted, largely thanks to the revelations around how much they had defrauded their own people. So that only would have come about thanks to old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. So the fun part of that was picking up envelopes brown envelopes full of documents from someone at a barber shop in London, thousands of miles away from where this was taking place, but that's where that source was, so that's where they were willing to meet. Unfortunately, we had people in London who could go and do that. I flew to Seoul from Hong Kong for a completely bizarre evening, where another source had more documents, and I was supposed to be Richard, I think, was my official "Hi, I'm Richard." And he, and then we ended up actually spending the entire evening in his hotel room, which must have been odd enough for the staff, but we went down to the business center at about 2 o'clock in the morning and started photocopying all the documents that he had, and we had another time one of our reporters flew to Honolulu because Najib Razak's wife was an enormous purchaser of luxury goods, and she was known to essentially walk into, I think it was a Chanel shop, I can't quite remember, the Chanel store in Honolulu, and basically buy up the shop to the point where their credit card got rejected, and the Prime Minister of Malaysia was on the phone calling his financier saying, "Have the bloody credit card turned back on because my wife has purchased all of these goods and I can't pay for them." So we had to try and confirm that. All right, so what does that? It means standing in a parking lot for 8 hours in Honolulu, waiting for the shop assistant to go off work, to come out to her car, and basically jumping out and saying, "Hi, I'm a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Were you there on the day that the Prime Minister, Malaysian Prime Minister's wife's credit card was rejected after she bought this exorbitant number of luxury goods?" "Yes." "Thank you." Right? So if you're not there, you won't get it. And I don't believe that you can do it from your seat. And it was one of the ironies of COVID, I guess, that news organizations in general were like, you have to go back to the office, and there's somebody senior coming in from, and they have to be seen. They want to see everybody in the office. So bums on seats, people. It wasn't that long ago that newspaper editors would walk into a newsroom and say, "Why the hell is everybody sitting at the computer? You ought to be out and you ought to be reporting." And I don't want to see a full newsroom until 4:45, right? So yes, times have changed. There's a lot you can do online, but in my experience, there is really no substitute for shoe leather.
Great story. Cherelle?
agree entirely. And I would have loved to have been that reporter that went to Honolulu.
He stood in the
That
park
would
and
have
he
been so
flew thousands of miles. And they were like, okay, you gotta come back.
So,
He didn't
your
jump, so-
story, oh, it was a he, so as a woman, you would just be in the shop, pretending to shop. So, a really good example now that, you've set an example here, is I was involved in a region-wide investigation in the Pacific by the New Zealand Herald, which is the main newspaper in New Zealand. And what happened was, there's more Samoans in New Zealand than there are in Samoa, which is why they have a good rugby team, among other things. So there was a member of parliament in New Zealand who was Samoan, and he had he had organized for a Thai gentleman to get a visa to New Zealand and work on his residency papers, so that this Tyler, he was a tile specialist, could go to Samoa and tile this MP's big mansion. So I was 19 and I get a phone call from the Herald, hey, we need to find the big mansion, we need to find the Tyler. And Samoa's a small place, right? So I just had to call my mom, who's the Thai chief, and was like, hey, do you know these people? She's like, yep, the house is here, this is the nephew of that guy, this is his daughter, this is the house. And so I was able to then, I did a stakeout at the mansion and took photos of the Tyler, and that made front page. And it was breaking news for them because I was the only one, they were the only news organization in New Zealand that had someone in Samoa who was able to track it down. So I do agree with you, without my presence there and my contacts on the ground, I think it would have been, a lot more of a difficult story to tell. He was eventually jailed. He was the first MP to be jailed for fraud. And it was ultimately trafficking as well. So it ended, it was a great investigative, piece, and it was fun to work on it. But, it did have implications on myself locally because we knew the family. And so there was definitely some threats, and to this day, there's implications of due to the fact that I worked on that story.
Robert?
Well, absolutely, I agree, whether it's essential for, not just, so-called investigative reporting, but even to do a good job on an ordinary story, you have to be there. I mean, whenever I have a conversation with a source of any kind who says, can we do this on the phone, I say, no, please, it's so much, as long as you're not, 10,000 miles away, let's meet, because you get so much more from that. This isn't really an investigative anecdote, but I used to spend a lot of time in Yemen when I was based in Beirut, just because it was I thought, a fascinating place. This is before the, Arab Spring. Then after, well, I guess even before then, the U.S. military had started using drones to kill Al-Qaeda figures, and then they started ramping it up, especially when Anwar al-Awlaki was being hunted down. When you spoke to Yemenis, inevitably, I'm sure this is true around the world, when the subject of drones came up, they would say, that's an outrage, because it's an insult to our sovereignty, this is terrible. Everybody would say that, no matter what their political inclination. But if you got to know them, sat with them, unfortunately in Yemen, there's this wonderful institution of chewing cot, where men, to some extent women as well, but mostly men, you spend the entire afternoon just sitting in a room, sipping tea, chewing these leaves, and yakking. For a journalist, it's heaven, because you can get invited very easily, and then you just sit for hours and hours and hours, and you talk. You have to know Arabic to do it, but eventually you make friends with these people. You talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. You're gonna learn all kinds of things. So if you get, in that period, I remember, I would talk to people about what had happened, and I'd try to find, you go from one hot shoe to the next, and maybe you have to go to a different city, but you find people who knew a lot about a particular drone strike, right? And they would all say at first, this is infuriating, this is some Zionist American thing, whatever. But if you really got to know them, talk to them, quite often they would say after a while, actually, if the Yemeni army had hunted this guy down and killed him, it would have been 10 times the casualties, because they don't know what they're doing. And I have to admit, it was horrible and infuriating, but they did just kill, well, it depended on the circumstance, but quite often, it was to kill that guy and a couple others. They would say, I don't really like it, but actually getting rid of this guy was, I have to admit, a good thing. You know, it was an awfully long way from the initial reaction, which is, you know, which we've gotten on the phone or something. So, I mean, it's just a little example of the way that if you have to spend a lot of time to get anything really valuable.
Fascinating. This is my last question, is taking the speaker's prerogative here as a moderator, and that is, what investigative story that hasn't been reported that you would like to be reported on? And I actually have an example of what I would like to see. I'm an old Hill rat from Capitol Hill, and as you know, funding over Ukraine is on the front pages every day, and it is talked about 25 hours a day on the Hill. And so the question is, on this issue, a slice of that would be, some of the arguments that I have heard on one side of the aisle is, are the European countries paying their fair share? Go back to NATO funding. Has any of the countries, maybe one or two, consistently paid their NATO dues? If they're not doing it in the NATO funding for decades, I haven't seen any numbers, the administration hasn't presented any numbers to me as to what they're paying. Is it a percentage, is it overall? Why is anybody reporting on this? Want to take a shot at that, Paul? Any other?
Yeah, I think, well, I think it's, so, quite often the best way to think about, as you said, investigative reporting and what would you like to know the answer to is really just by asking the question. I do think, not to press it down, because we may not be working on. No, really, press it may not be working on, but I know it's become a very political issue, but where is the money going? Where is the money going to Ukraine? Ukraine went from being very, you know, in a very short space of years, from being labeled as a very corrupt country to being the recipient of huge amounts of Western aid. And that is not to judge the merits of that at all, and I would want any investigative reporter that we put on this, any reporter we put on this, to look at it with an open mind. But has that been money that went to the places that it should have gone to? And if so, that would be an interesting conclusion to know. And if it didn't, that would also be an interesting conclusion to know. So either way, I think you'd find out, you'd come up with a fascinating answer if the West, broadly speaking, has been, and this is less on the arms side and more on the economic aid side. I think the West has been funding a large portions of the Ukrainian government for the last couple of years. And if it would just be a revelatory one way or the other, not prejudge it, to move on.
Thank you, really appreciate that. Cherelle?
It's also money related, and it's really on climate financing, on tracking how much of climate financing that's being pledged at the Conference of the Parties and through the climate regime, so to speak. How much of that actually reaches the ground? Because you have billions of dollars being pledged for frontline communities and small island nations, but you don't necessarily see that being translated on the ground. So it would be lovely to see, delve deeper into those numbers and see, like, does it hit the ground? How much of it is being cut? And I know for a fact that the United Nations has like a large administrative fee, and then the countries have their own little cuts here and there. And then of course, if you're going through the World Bank, they have their own cuts. So by the time that money hits the ground where it's meant to make a difference in the climate, in adaptation, mitigation, and so forth, it actually has lost much of its value. And another one, just as you're talking about the wars, what is the actual carbon footprint of a war? That would be super interesting. The environmental damage and the carbon footprints would be awesome to gauge in one way or another.
Well,
this isn't so much a story as an area, but I'd like to know an awful lot more about the Wagner group, the Russian mercenaries. They're just, it's one of those, some things are almost impossible to report on, and Wagner's one of them. There's been plenty of stories about them, but sort of independent information, you just can't get very close to them because they're really, really dangerous. There was an interesting piece in the journal last week by Michael Gordon, I think, about the Wagner possibly supplying weapons to Hezbollah. But again, I haven't seen anything since then. And I mean, there's the adage, that those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. It applies to Iran. I mean, there's all kinds of investigative stories over the years that have cropped up that I would like to know the answers to. It's just simply impossible to get anywhere on that side of things. It's unfortunately true, with Wagner as well, because Russia is becoming one of those places, I think, where it's soil, as we know.
Great, thank you.
I have one more. Fire away. I would like to know, everybody reports on all of these data breaches all the time by state actors, right? The Chinese, the North Koreans, happens all the time. The amount of data that they reportedly steal and the type of information they reportedly steal is extraordinary and very personal. And I would like to know what happens next. What do they do with it? They have, remember that OPM hack was millions and millions of pieces of data about me. Where does it go? What do they do with it? And is there any way that you can actually trace it back to actions that they take? Or is it the purloining of that data that is actually the goal? I would just like to know what happens once that data has been taken. What do state actors who take it do with it afterwards? And what are the consequences of those hacks? Are they designed just to freak us out? Or are they actually collated and organized in a way that means that they can then be used as a meaningful threat back to the country they're taken from?
Great, thank you, Paul. Well, that concludes my questions, and I'd like to open it up for the audience. I will hand the microphone to Sasha, and then please take it and identify yourself and give me your question.
All right, well, may I first, Joe? Okay. I have a question too, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, you want to go first?
Now you go first.
All right. Today we are complex about the issue of civilian deaths in Gaza. But if you look around the world, civilian deaths are huge in South Sudan, including children. Civilian deaths are huge in Yemen, including children. What about civilian deaths in China, the Uyghurs? What about civilian deaths in Burma, the Rohingyas? So my question is, why isn't anybody paying attention to those probably equally as disturbing situations? And why are we only focusing on Gaza?
I'm very happy for Robert to take that one.
I would just say, I think it's a good question. I think there was a very good piece in the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago about civilian deaths in the battle in Iraq against ISIS. That started off with information supplied by the Pentagon and then kind of reverse engineered and saw all kinds of other. And to its credit, the Pentagon did provide, a fair amount of data to that reporter. But then the reporter did really excellent work and determined that the number was much, much, much higher, quite reliably, much, much higher. That won out a couple of big prizes. So I mean, it has been done for some parts of the world. Kashmir, I think there's a lot going on that no one is reporting on. Partly because there's been this terrible trend of governments coming after reporters and making their lives hell. India, which used to, I first reported in India in the mid-1990s when I was a grad student. You could go anywhere and do anything. There were almost no obstacles. And now it's really becoming almost impossible. There's very few independent outlets there. And last time I applied for a visa as an American to go to India, I was turned down, which shocked me. So Kashmir has become an almost impossible place to report. That's just sort of a digression. But I take your point. Then I think there should be more like that Times Magazine piece investigating all over the place.
I do think you're right. Thank you for me. No, I do think your point is excellent, but I think it's both the good and the bad in the news business. I think if you look back, then a lot of us have reported on the civilian casualties in the areas that you're talking about. Like, I know we've written about the Rohingyas a lot, I know we've written about the Uyghurs a lot, I know we've written about the great satellite in the sky, which is the global media business, is going to adjust to wherever the hottest action is, and that's where it's going to go, and that sometimes will come at the exclusion of other things that aren't as of the moment, and so it is good that we have so much reporting from what's happening in Gaza, right? I mean, it's better that we have that, it's good that we know that, and that will be a priority for every global news organization indefinitely, but it will, and there will have been times when those other stories were priorities and did get that spotlight. But there's, realistically speaking, there's only one or two spotlights at a time.
If I may just add here, Ambassador, that's a great question. There is this agreement, so first of all, globally, there's coverage of those issues, especially in media organizations in those respective geographies. So I know you're asking about US mainstream media, but there, to your point on like, two things can take, precedent at any point. In covering for international media from the global south, I knew that if 2 white lives died in my country, I could get the attention of bureau chiefs for Asia and the Pacific. And 2 white lives equated to about 8 to 10 brown lives. So it would take the metric of coverage where I could get the attention of the bureau chief in Singapore or Bangkok, was there at least needed to be 8 people of my land, of my home country, that needed to have died in a certain way. But if 1 British person died, that would get me the attention of the BBC and the Guardian. So civilian deaths really are dependent on the agenda set by that particular news media organization. And let's be real, the tone and the priorities of news coverage internationally have been set by the global north editors. And so as long as the agenda of news organizations are set by, say, US-centric approaches, we will not necessarily have fair coverage of civilian deaths in those particular geographies.
Just add, when I made my first forays as a grad student in journalism, I was in India in 1990, what it was, mid-1990s. And I had talked to an editor before I left, and he said, I don't care about India, I mean, it's gotta be 300 dead at least, or else I'm not gonna write anything. That was his entire comment, but.
You kind of need it, right?
So the poor Sudanese have no hope whatsoever, right? Okay.
Were you good?
So can I ask questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have the mic.
All right, cool. Let me just stand up.
And please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, my name is Nee Simmons, I'm a non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council, their Geotech Center. I'm Ghanaian American, I have a development finance background, I used to work at the World Bank Group and IFC. I've done a little bit of everything around the continent. My question is very simple. As Africa scales from about 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion people, what's your thoughts about getting more Western news outlets to even have bureaus in Africa to report and to hire Africans or the diaspora, Africans who can tell their own story, right? As Africa scales to 2.5 billion people, I just wrote a piece about critical rare earth minerals. I'm trying to, let the West know that Africa has an opportunity to not only support Africa, but tell the story and support innovative solutions from Africa to the rest of the world. But these stories have to be, there needs to be bureaus on the ground. CGTN, the Chinese, they have a bureau in Kenya. I think Wall Street Journal has something in South Africa, I'm not too sure, but we just need more bureaus on the continent. So I guess that's a question, you know, what's your thoughts to that? Africans need to tell their own story, and I don't like this term global south. I think it's kind of demeaning. I like to use the term frontier and emerging markets, right? You know, once you start to divide things, I think, because words matter. Words matter. News, the definitions that are bestowed upon some of us, our countries in developing markets, it just, you start perpetrating these myths, people look at
Really do like your point on having local journalists cover local stories. We just hired at the climate desk, we have our own climate correspondents, and we just hired someone out of Kenya. He's local, well-established in the local media community there. So I am of this firm belief that the best stories can be told by the people of that community. Now, as a journalist in Samoa, there was nothing more offensive to me than having a correspondent fly in from DC to cover my country, a political issue in my country, and I'm the fixer translating the interviews and create. So it was, I felt like I was telling the story and doing the work, but we needed the correspondent to lend credibility to the story. So I do agree to some extent with your statement there, but the AP has offices all over the world, and there's a bureau also in several places around the Africa region.
Well, I think it's inevitable. I mean, you know, Africa's population is going to be, as you said, just you know, such a much greater proportion of the world than it is now in a few decades. I mean, I think of the way that these bureaus wax and wane. Unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with perceived crises. You know, so before 9/11, the entire Middle East was covered by the New York Times anyway, from really one reporter in Cairo. Everything from Morocco to Oman was covered by one person. And then you had Israel, which was also its own bureau, but that was somehow considered apart from the region. And then after 9/11, it grew, and then after the Iraq War, my God, Iraq alone was a vast bureau with spending millions and millions of dollars, you know, to rent the house. And then, you know, in the past couple of years, there's been a perceived winding down somehow of the global war on terror and everything associated with it. So all those bureaus shrank. Of course, in the past couple of weeks, they've all tried to jack them up again. But I think with Africa, it's way economically it's going to be felt, and that's probably when you know you'll. I hope it's not going to be a function of wars, but I think it's inevitable that you will see that. Just to briefly address what you're saying, I mean, I think there's an injustice often in the way that it works, but I also think, you know, I mean, like you guys, I've you know, come very close to a lot of local reporters in bureaus where I have lived and worked. But I do think there's you know, the legitimate need to train people in the standards that you use in your newsroom, and so you know, inevitably they're going to privilege someone who knows those, wherever that person comes from, to come out and be the reporter. But I think also there's been a greater recognition. I think the Times has a lot more people who are from those regions, you know, contributing to the stories than they used to. There's a lot more. You'll see a lot more names that are African in Africa, and a lot more names that are Middle Eastern in the Middle East than we used to have. And fortunately, there's also been a great recognition of local reporters and fixers. Some people don't like the term, but we all use it. I actually help to judge every year an award for fixers that was put together at Reuters, Kurt Short Award. And I hope it's, you know, helping to, you know, grant some recognition to these people. Many of whom will go on to be journalists themselves, but who do just incredibly important work in getting all this journalism done.
Other questions?
Hi there. Interesting discussion. Just your
What's your name?
sorry, my name is Lilay, and I'm a recovering journalist. So I'm not going to mention the organizations I've polluted over the years. But a very good point, really good listening to all your points. Mr. Starr, your point about how much different countries paying to NATO. I think if you look on the other side and see how many countries are paying the United Nations dues. Right, you know how much America pays, how far behind this. So it's a matter of priorities. Do you want defense and war, or do you want peace? My question, and also your point, is that yes, the Western media does focus on things, but somebody likened it to a cyclops. It has one eye, and everything is in this one eye. And as soon as it sees something else, boom, all gone. It's on to the next issue. And so unfortunately this occurs, so a lot of things do not get covered. I have a double question. One is, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has done an awful lot of really good work, which is then bled into the mainstream media. Do you see the ICIJ and their work as influencing the role of investigative journalism, and indeed of journalism generally in the metropolitan centers? They're doing things with the Panama Papers and others which no one else could have busted, but they did it because they combined. And the second question is probably to Mr. Worth. With Al Jazeera, we saw how that changed the face of international media. And of course, the Qataris got it early. And the question is, can we expect to see more Middle Eastern countries with significant sovereign funds buying major media in the West? If so, where will it be, and who will be doing it? And why did the Qataris decide to do it in the first place? It was a pretty bright move.
Well, I thought the second question first. You said, will they buy major media in the West? I mean, Al Jazeera, after all, is
By companies.
Okay. Al Jazeera, was initially broadcasting in Arabic. Only much later did the English version. And I think for them, it served all kinds of purposes. They're a very profoundly insecure country that is surrounded by huge and powerful neighbors, and they have a lot of oil to guard. So for them, it was a way to have a big bullhorn that they got them noticed. And it's been a very mixed blessing, if one calls it a blessing at all. I mean, it's tends to be tendentious in its reporting. It's waxed and waned over the years in terms of its standards, but there were periods when it was often bad. I mean, Al Jazeera's reporting on the Syrian conflict was, at certain points, a little better than rumors, phoned in by rebels who wanted to believe something that was true and it wasn't. So the Middle East is full of satellite stations and full of newspapers of all different kinds, and unfortunately they're almost universally viewed as political weapons. I mean, you could look at Lebanon, which has the freest. The media there is so free that the joke is going, we have too much media freedom in Lebanon. Almost all the papers are owned by oligarchs of one sort or another who use them to get their point across, to intimidate certain people or woo certain people. It's very hard to find journalistic organs that have real integrity. There was one, I think it may be still going, in Tunisia that I found very hopeful, called Intifada, kind of like Intifada, but ink. And they published initially just in Arabic and French, because of Tunisia's French background, but they would do very much investigative projects, something that was important that had to be uncovered that was going to piss people off. And it was just a website. They didn't have any print. But every time they did a major investigation, it was picked up and repeated by all of the Tunisian newspapers and television stations. And so it was like a ProPublica model, sort of, we'll do something that will have a multiplier effect when it's broadcast by other people. So I'm not so keen on the idea of more stations like Jazeera. I just think what we need is, in the Middle East and everywhere else, people who are willing to spend money to create media organizations where they really inculcate integrity solid reporting.
I wasn't actually referring to the quality of the media in the Middle East. I was thinking more about the possibility of very, very rich Middle Easterners buying American media companies. Something like, MBS buying the Wall Street Journal, like Rupert Murdoch, who was a foreigner at the time when he bought it, things like that. They're spending billions of dollars greenwashing themselves through sport. What do you suspect that at some point in time they may like to sort of do a bit more sort of polishing of their images by buying American media companies?
Yeah, that's a frightening thought. I haven't heard of that being a possibility, but I think, people would find it troubling.
Yeah, but the thing is, the most important thing for most people is sports, right? And look at the ownership of soccer clubs in Britain.
Yeah.
Who owns them all?
Oh, yeah.
Why do they get owned? This is, you're talking about real, sort of visceral issues for most people. So I think veracity of the media is probably something that they like to talk about. But in essence, what would be the outcry if Mohammed bin Salman bought, say, the Wall Street Journal?
It wouldn't.
I don't think he'd be interested, to be honest. I think, he does these things to serve his own purposes.
Well, as you buy the New York Post, but still, I'm talking about what do you think about the possibility of Middle Eastern, sovereign funds or enormously rich people, or oligarchs for that matter, buying American media companies?
I just can't think of any one of those oligarchs for whom it would be useful to do that. I mean, if you find an example, I'm happy to talk about it. But these guys all have some agenda. God knows MBS has something very specific in mind when he is buying up these sports companies, and it's like the Emiratis with soccer teams and so forth. I don't think they would even want to do this. And of course, if they ever did, then you encounter the second question of, would it be plausible? How would it work out? And would anybody accept it here? And so forth. But like I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of a rationale for it.
There's no rationale for buying sports teams either, initially. I think just a matter of buying influence is what it's all about. And I think that this sounds like a very good investigative story for somebody. Cherelle, you could do it, because Samoa's leading the world in rugby, so start with rugby.
No, we did really bad in the World Cup, so that was sad. But I wanted to just, if the moderator allows me, so I wanted to make a comment on your comment on the ICIJ's role in the Panama Papers and so forth. What we're seeing in the media now is an influx of philanthropic funding supporting journalism. And so the work that ICIJ has done has a really amazing influence in uncovering a lot of things. But this new model of journalism where you get foundation funding to support news media to do its work is a very encouraging sign in terms of the sustainability of journalism. You see a good example of that is The Guardian. Prior to 2010, The Guardian did not acknowledge that there were indeed Pacific Islands, or indeed human beings living in that part of the world. They then secured funding through an Australian foundation to only report on the Pacific Islands. And so The Guardian, within 2 years, has reported more stories from the Pacific than any other international news media. And that was because there was concentrated foundation funding with the sole purpose of covering the Pacific Islands. And so this is the case also with the AP. We have philanthropic funding to cover the climate crisis. So I think it relates to your question of the role of organizations like that, but more to the point, the role of strategic funding, that it doesn't come with strings attached to continue the work that we do as journalists.
I would just quickly add, I don't know much about the ICIJ, I think you mentioned, but there's been a flowering of other groups that I think are fantastic that do similar work. I mean, for instance, in India, there's the Reporters Collective. India's become such a hostile place for journalists, and by banding together, they can protect each other much better. And then there's the OCCRP in the Balkans and elsewhere, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So there's, to some extent anyway, there's safety in numbers, and that's my great help.
I would only probably in part at least because of our own circumstances, but your Cyclops comment and the, you know, why aren't we everywhere reporting on all of these things all at once? The fact that we are anywhere reporting anything at the moment is something of a triumph, because it is an incredibly hostile world in which reporters do their jobs. And I think that can get quite easily lost if you're worried about how much reporting you're getting out of one particular country. Just take Russia. Is there a country in the world that is more relevant to the United States fortunes right now than Russia? And if Russia is going to lock up its journalists, how are you going to get any information at all? There have been 36 reporters killed in Gaza. We used to have dozens of people in China, and now we're down to a handful, and they have to report on outside. I think the flip side of why aren't you reporting on this is the incredible difficulty that it is reporting in far too many countries around the world, including India, as you said, which is, it is amazing the information that you do get by reporters putting themselves out there to get that information and report it back under worse and worse circumstances.
Questions?
Yeah.
And please identify yourself.
Thank you so much for the panel. My name is Ulyana Boychuk. I'm a Ukrainian journalist here, and actually I write down my question because it's supposed to be very complicated, and I will try to explain what I'm seeing and what I want you to answer to. So, water has bad and good side, yes, and in the battlefield we have bad and good side, and in the journalism also we had a good and a bad side. The bad side in war in Ukraine now is Russian propaganda, and the good side in journalism in Ukraine now is freedom of media, the main topic we are talking about today. And that freedom of media is important for democracy, for human rights, for everything we have today. And my question is about, so while we are doing our investigation, while we are doing our stories and our reports, and I think that one of the biggest challenge is to be objective while we're doing that. And how to be objective and not to damage that good side of the war we have today in Ukraine and in Israel also. So how to keep being objective, doing your work, doing your investigation and doing your stories, and not to damage a good side of the war. Thank you.
What was your question, and how would we go about doing that? I mean, the very simple answer, and it's very trite and probably very irritating, is proceed cautiously and focus on the facts. I think anybody who decides that they know what the story is in advance and therefore closes off their mind to the possibility that the story might be different at the end than it was at the beginning, then what's the point in investigating? You already know the answer. Right? So one of the things that it's a fine balance often between knowing enough to launch into a story and to know what your preliminary targets are going to be and what you expect the outcome to be. But up until the day of publication, realize that there may be some piece of this that you are missing, and you need to know what those pieces are. And you at least you need to not cut yourself off from the possibility that there may be contradictory information out there that might undermine your entire thesis for however long you've been working on that story. But if you do find that information, then your obligation as a journalist is to go back to the beginning story again. So, that's the piece of it, is that you have to be open-minded enough not to make assumptions that lead you to the conclusion that you wanted to come to, and that is a conclusion that you probably had, that you've been building towards, and it's always disappointing to find out that what you were looking for. Part of investigative journalism is all the investigations that don't lead you to the place that you thought they were going to lead to. And that's a tremendous amount of time, and after 7 months you go to your editor and you say, Yeah, absolutely, actually nothing. So no, sorry, yeah, didn't work out the way I was thinking, but you have to, but any good editor will say, it happened. And the point is, you were in it, and you ran it down, and you know everything, and you got the answer. Is that answer a story? Maybe it isn't, but now we know it's not. That's the sort of calculation that I think is the only way to keep yourself honest, because the deeper you go, the more stakes you have personally in the outcome that you would like to have, that you would like to see, and you have to be honest enough with yourself to say, am I being intellectually comprehensive to constantly test that thesis until you're so sure and you're so aware of the contradicting information that you're going to go and publish anyway.
And how to deal with Russian propaganda who can use that information against Ukrainians or against good side of the war? You know what I'm talking about?
What?
Like that fact, as for example, some investigation and Russian propaganda use that fact that you have from your investigation against the good side of the war, you know? And how to be, as a person, how to feel that you doing something not good for good side of the war.
Yeah, very, very difficult, but what other people do with your information is a whole different ballgame to providing the information in the first place, and you just have to trust that that has to be the thing that prevails, and do your best to make that thing that prevails. I guess that's a very inadequate answer, even as I'm saying it, but I do hear your anxiety about it and other things.
Anyone else? With that?
I have a question.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you.
Oh, do you have-
There's one in the back.
Okay, we do have time.
Okay, please intervene. Pete.
Would you discuss how you prepare reporters to go out in the field and do investigative work in closed societies?
Well, on the first plus of that is just on the physical side of things, right? You know, we at the Journal, and we implemented a lot of this after Danny Pearl was killed in Karachi. So we keep as tight a leash as we reasonably can, both in terms of security preparations, in terms of environments, hostile environment training, hostile environment preparation, security accompanied by security if we need to. There's a host of things that we do. It's a very elaborate process, and it really takes for anybody going into a closed society that we think will put a reporter at risk, requires a huge number of approvals and discussion, and what we hope is clear-eyed assessment of the situation. I don't have to tell you that that is not foolproof, because we have a reporter who's been in jail in Russia for the last 7 months. So you minimize the risk as much as you possibly can. You can never eliminate it, and sometimes it will come back to bite you. In terms of how to approach things, same, you know, if you're going to a place, what do you do with your computer? What do you do with your phone, right? Do you take a burner phone, you take a clean computer? You know, there are all those sorts of, depending on the country, there are also pretty elaborate series of steps. I'm afraid we've learned the hard way, and it's still not foolproof. So there's a lot you can do, and there's sometimes then you can never do enough.
Well, I have a last question then. Okay. Can you tell us anything what's happening in Devon in the trial, and are you pleased with the government efforts? And is this to the extent that you
Yeah,
can?
thank you for the question. It's very opaque. So for any of you that don't know, so I've referred to it several times already, but Evan Gershkovich is a 32-year-old reporter for the Wall Street Journal who was pulled out of a restaurant with a check over his head by the FSB in Yekaterinburg on March 29th, and has since spent the entire time in the Lagipoiva prison, security services prison in Moscow. His consistently said, as has the government, as has the chairman of the Senate. So, he can be held on a series of pretrial detentions that go for 3 months. The latest of those will expire on November 28th. Russian law says that he can be held for up to 1 year by that, but then there are extenuating circumstances that could possibly extend that. So the difficulty for us is the capacity. We don't know, we're nobody at trial, we've seen no evidence that they've presented to trial. We assume a trial would be as bogus as the charges anyway, at which point he will be convicted, and if Paul Whelan's case is ending to go by convicted and sentenced up to 20 years in prison. So that is a timeline. We don't know when the trial will be, but that's a timeline we are trying our damnedest to avoid.
Paul, thank you for that update, I appreciate it. Let me give, before I close, let me give Cherelle and Robert an opportunity to just, any closing remarks you'd like to give?
Sure, I think since it's a media freedom conference and sessions that we've been having, it's important to remember that, you know, issues of press freedom occur globally, and every journalist, irrespective of which beat, has, you know, come across some sort of challenge in the pursuit of truth and pursuit of their work. So I just wanted to reiterate that there is, you know, common experience when it comes to the challenges of reporting, especially investigative reporting. Regardless of how safe the society is, there are, you know, levels of risk associated, you know, from the unfortunate and sad occurrence, you know, with your colleagues, to things like families being threatened or women being raped who are journalists because they're covering stories. This happens. 2 years ago, I worked with the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights and Violence Against Women to produce a report on violence against women journalists. I spoke to well over 100 women journalists from the Africa region. We did a consultation in Nairobi, in the Pacific Islands. We did a consultation in Australia, in the US, Latin America, and so forth. And every journalist shared something that is a challenge that is similar to each other. So I guess I wanted to offer that, you know, there's hardship in the work that we do, but there's also solidarity in that the challenges are similar, but also the rewards of what we do are also similar.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, well, this is something that's been said, but I would just say, again, you know, we live in a difficult time for journalists, and I'm not sure the general public is aware, as aware of that as they ought to be. I know, just because it's not, you know, journalists themselves don't often talk about it too much, and partly for you know, careerist reasons. I mean, I was thinking of writing an essay a couple of years back about how many, I mean, I was blacklisted from Turkey for 6 years, couldn't enter the country just because of the story they didn't like. You know, I feel embarrassed even mentioning that because Turkey has jailed, you know, hundreds of reporters and many other people have blacklisted. But you know, the past decade's been a really, really bad time for press freedom. And when I was considering writing an essay about this, I thought to myself, if I complain in public about Turkey's treatment, that won't help me get off the blacklist. And it might extend it. And if I complain about India's treatment, that probably won't help either. So I mean, there are reasons for us not to complain too badly about this. But there are advocates who I hope, and I know some of them are, you know, out there just putting out the figures and making clear how unfortunately good some governments have gotten at intimidating and bullying and silencing journalists. So let's just hope it gets better.
Amen. Well, I do want to end on a optimistic note. So with a little bit of levity underlying the seriousness of this discussion, I'll just kind of review what we've talked about today, and that is from First Lady shopping sprees to Ty Tylers to going from cat chat to cat shack chat, but finally wondering what the carbon footprint is of war. It has been a fascinating discussion, and we at the Transatlantic Leadership Network are deeply grateful for your presence here. I've learned a lot, I can tell you that. You keep us honest and keep doing what you're doing, and This concludes our TLIP conference today. And I want to invite everyone to join us for the reception over in the National Press Ballroom at 6:30. And with that, thank you for attending.